The mountains slept beneath a blanket of mist, their breath rolling down into the valley where the orphanage stood, a lonesome spire of blackened timber and frost. The locals called it Whispering Pines, though few dared to utter the name after sunset. They said the wind there didn't move, it remembered. Clara Wren arrived just as the first snow began to fall, her boots sinking into the mud of the long-forgotten road. The carriage driver refused to go farther, crossing himself before turning back toward town. She stood alone at the gate, clutching the letter of employment in her hand, its ink already smudged by the cold. The building ahead seemed less like a home for children and more like a mausoleum left standing out of stubbornness. From the attic windows, something shifted, a pale face? A curtain? She could not tell. But the faintest hum drifted through the air, high and tremulous, like a child's lullaby sung through a locked door. When the front door creaked open, the air smelled faintly of smoke and lavender. A woman in mourning black waited there, her face veiled, her voice like paper crumbling. "You must be Miss Wren," she said softly. "The children have been waiting for you." The door closed behind her with the weight of a tombstone. And from somewhere deep within the house, beyond the shuttered hallways, behind the forbidden west wing, a whisper rose through the floorboards. A child's voice, barely audible, but certain. "She's come back." The road to Whispering Pines was not on any map Clara Wren could find. The carriage driver had followed her directions until the path thinned into dirt and the trees grew unnaturally close, bending over the road like conspirators. By the time they reached the rusted iron gates, the afternoon sun had already begun to dissolve into the soft grey of Vermont's autumn dusk. The driver muttered a short prayer before setting down her single suitcase, refusing the extra coins she offered. "No one goes past here after dark," he warned, his eyes fixed on the tree line. Then he was gone, the sound of the horse fading into the distance, leaving Clara in the muffled silence of the forest. She stood before the orphanage, a sprawling, timbered house with windows that stared out like empty eyes. The building's silhouette rose against the mist, its roof slanted and broken in places, as though it had survived a storm that never truly ended. She tightened her shawl around her shoulders, breathing in the scent of pine and damp earth, and for the briefest moment she thought she heard something moving among the branches. A laugh, or perhaps the wind. She shook the thought away. The letter in her pocket was creased from rereading. Caretaker needed for the Whispering Pines Orphanage. Room and board included. Immediate start. No signature, just an ink-stamped seal she didn't recognize. It wasn't ideal work, but Clara had little choice. The city had grown dangerous for a woman alone, and she needed to disappear somewhere quiet, somewhere no one would come looking for her. An orphanage seemed harmless enough. When she finally pushed open the gate, its hinges screamed through the fog. The crunch of dead leaves beneath her boots echoed too loudly. The path led to a porch whose steps sagged under her weight. Each board creaked as if the house were sighing in its sleep. She knocked once, twice. No answer. Then, faintly, she heard the sound of a child humming high, tuneless, but steady from somewhere deep inside. The door opened on its own, slow and deliberate. Warm light spilled into the entryway, though no lamp could be seen. The air inside smelled faintly of smoke, and beneath it, something sweet and rotten. A woman's figure appeared in the gloom, a long black dress, a mourning veil. Her voice was papery and thin. "You must be Miss Wren," she said. "The children have been expecting you." Clara stepped across the threshold, and the door closed behind her with a hollow thud. The humming stopped. The silence that followed pressed close around her, thick and waiting, as though the house itself was listening. The first morning at Whispering Pines began with the sound of footsteps that weren't her own. Clara woke to the creak of floorboards outside her door, followed by the soft patter of movement retreating down the hall. When she opened the door, no one was there. Only the faint smell of candle wax lingered, and from somewhere below, the low hum of voices, small, melodic, almost rehearsed. She followed the sound to the dining hall, where 12 children sat in absolute stillness, hands folded neatly beside their plates. They ranged in age from 6 to perhaps 13, all dressed in the same grey linen uniforms. Their faces were pale and watchful, their eyes fixed on her with unnerving calm. "Good morning," she offered gently, setting down the tray she carried. "I'm Miss Wren. I'll be taking care of you for a while." The children didn't answer. Not a single nod, not a whisper. Only the faint hum returned, like a breath caught between them, too low to trace to any one mouth. Clara smiled uncertainly and began serving porridge, pretending not to notice the way they followed her movements in perfect unison, each spoon lifted and lowered at the exact same moment. When she asked their names, she was met with silence again. A small girl at the end of the table tilted her head, her lips parted as though she might speak, but instead she pressed her fingers to her throat and shook her head once, slowly. Another boy reached for a piece of chalk resting on the windowsill and began to write on the wall beside him, not words, only strange looping symbols, over and over, until his fingers were dusted white. Later that afternoon, Clara found herself in the courtyard, raking leaves while the children played beneath the twisted pines. There was no laughter, no shouts, no songs. Only the whisper of their shoes in the dirt and that same low humming rising and falling like the wind through hollow wood. When she called to them, asking what tune they were singing, the smallest boy turned toward her, eyes glassy, lips unmoving. The sound continued, though none of them seemed to be making it. It came from everywhere at once, the branches, the walls, even the ground beneath her feet. That evening, she asked the veiled woman about it over dinner. The woman's spoon froze midway to her mouth. "The children are quiet by nature," she said, her tone clipped and final. "They've learned it's best not to make noise after dark." Then she rose from the table, leaving Clara alone with the echo of that faint, ceaseless hum that seemed to come from inside the house itself. The West Wing was the only part of the orphanage Clara had not explored. From her first night, the veiled woman had warned her firmly, almost pleadingly, never to go near it. The wing was damaged in the fire, she said, unsafe and unfit for anyone to enter. But the way her voice trembled told Clara it wasn't the building's structure that frightened her, it was something else entirely. Still, curiosity lingered. Every hallway in Whispering Pines carried a quiet dread, but the corridor leading to the West Wing felt different, colder, as though the air itself grew thin the closer one came to it. Even during the day, a draft seeped through the keyhole of the locked door, carrying with it the faint scent of ash and something metallic, like rust or dried blood. For several nights, Clara told herself she wouldn't go near it, that she was only imagining things. Yet sleep eluded her. Each night, as the house settled into silence, she began to hear faint sounds from beyond the forbidden door, a slow scraping, like fingernails on wood, followed by what might have been laughter. It was soft, almost playful, but too far away to belong to any living child. When she mentioned it to the woman the next morning, she was met with a sharp look. "Do not listen," the woman said. "The house remembers things best left forgotten." That night, the wind rose violently, rattling the windows. The orphans slept without stirring, their faces oddly serene, as though untouched by the storm. Clara sat by her candle, reading the headmistress's old ledger, when a flicker of movement caught her eye. Down the hall, faint and steady, a line of warm light spilled from beneath the door of the West Wing. She froze. The air around her shifted, colder now, pressing against her skin. She stood, her heartbeat quick and shallow, and the floorboards groaned beneath her weight as she took one cautious step after another toward the light. The closer she came, the clearer she heard it, a child's voice, humming the same haunting melody that had echoed through the orphanage since her arrival. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the house creaking. It was a song. She reached the door and touched the knob. It was cold, almost icy, and when she leaned closer, she could make out whispers layered beneath the tune, faint and overlapping, as if several voices were speaking all at once. Then, without warning, the light vanished. The hum stopped. Only her own breathing filled the hall, and the silence pressed so tightly around her it felt alive. Clara began her duties in earnest on the third day, sorting through the piles of neglected paperwork left to gather dust in the orphanage's cramped study. The room was dim, the curtains heavy with age, and the smell of mildew hung thick in the air. She had been told to keep the records in order, birth certificates, adoption papers, letters from sponsors, but most of what she found was useless. Ink had bled into the pages, names were crossed out, and whole sections of ledgers were missing. The fire that the veiled woman spoke of had supposedly destroyed part of the building 2 years earlier, though Clara noticed the soot never seemed to touch the walls. Instead, it clung to the papers, smudging her fingers black as she turned each brittle page. Hours passed in silence except for the occasional moan of the floorboards. The orphans were outside in their daily routine, their humming faint through the open window. Clara tried to focus, yet a growing unease stirred in her chest. None of the documents she'd seen dated earlier than 1887. It was as if the orphanage had simply appeared from nothing after that year, no records of its founding, no mention of the children who might have lived there before. She found one entry labeled Incident Report, Air Fire Damage, but the section beneath it was entirely blank, save for the faint impression of handwriting that had been erased, as though someone had pressed hard into the paper before deciding to conceal every word. She searched the shelves for older files, but half were empty boxes, their labels torn away. Behind one stack, she discovered a small wooden drawer nailed shut. She pried it open carefully, splinters catching her skin, and inside found a handful of photographs warped by heat. The edges were singed, the images faded, but she could make out the shape of the building, the same gabled roof, the same pines in the background. What caught her breath was the group of children standing in front of it, smiling faintly at the camera. There were 12 of them, arranged in 2 rows. She recognized their faces immediately. When she turned the photograph over, she saw a date scrawled faintly in pencil, 1885. 2 years before the orphanage had supposedly reopened. Beneath the date was a single phrase, written in the same faint hand: "The first ones were never meant to leave." A sudden draft swept through the room, scattering loose pages across the floor. For an instant, Clara thought she heard whispers rising from beneath them, a dozen soft voices speaking in unison, too quiet to understand. The forest behind the orphanage stretched farther than Clara had imagined, a maze of narrow paths swallowed by pine and fog. She discovered it by accident, chasing the sound of laughter that drifted through the open windows one grey afternoon. It was the first time she had heard the children make any sound resembling joy. Something about the image felt different now. When she tilted it toward the candlelight, faint details began to emerge, shadows that hadn't been visible before. Behind the children, near the tree line, stood another figure. It was little more than a blur, tall and indistinct, but its presence was unmistakable. It looked like a woman in a dark dress, her head turned toward the camera, though her face was obscured by a smear of ash. Clara's stomach tightened. She flipped the photograph over, searching for a clue, and there, beneath the penciled date, noticed a second marking she hadn't seen before, a small circle drawn in ink, enclosing the number 13. The candle flickered again, and the edges of the photograph curled slightly from the heat. She was about to set it aside when she noticed something else. On the back of the image, pressed faintly into the paper, was another photograph, one stuck to it by age and soot. She peeled them apart carefully, the paper brittle and dry, and as the layers separated, she froze. The second image was nearly identical to the first, except for one detail: the children were gone. Only the empty orphanage stood beneath the same grey sky, the same pine trees looming behind it. A faint rustling made her look up. The sound came from behind her, soft footsteps crossing the floor, too light to belong to the veiled woman. She turned, heart pounding, but no one was there. Only the window was open now, its latch undone, the curtains breathing inward with the cold. When she looked back down, the top photograph had changed. The figure in the background was no longer standing near the trees. It was closer now, almost at the steps of the orphanage, and though the image was faded, Clara could almost swear its hand was reaching toward the camera. The first whisper came just before dawn, faint as a sigh against the walls. Clara woke with the uneasy sense that someone had been standing over her bed, though the room was empty when she opened her eyes. The candle she had left burning had gone out, yet the air still smelled faintly of smoke. For a moment she thought it might have been the wind, until she heard it again, a murmur threading through the wooden beams, delicate and deliberate, forming words too soft to decipher. She sat up slowly, the blanket drawn to her chest, and listened. The voices seemed to move, passing through the room like a breeze, slipping into the hallway beyond her door. She rose and followed, barefoot, her steps soundless on the cold floorboards. The corridor stretched long and narrow, the wallpaper peeling in ghostly curls. The whispering grew clearer the closer she came to the staircase, not chaotic but patterned, as if reciting something. Then she caught it, a name. Faint, stretched thin through the wood, spoken in a child's voice. Emmeline. Then another. Samuel. One by one the names came, overlapping in rhythm, each spoken by a different voice. Clara froze at the bottom of the stairs, the chill seeping through her nightgown as she listened. The names repeated, some she recognized from the grave markers, others unfamiliar, whispered with a strange tenderness, like children answering roll call. She backed away, her breath trembling in the air, but the sound followed her, threading through the floorboards beneath her feet. It rose from the cracks in the wood, circling her, growing louder until she could make out the faint echo of her own name among them. Clara. It was spoken softly, almost lovingly, but the sweetness in it made her stomach twist. She pressed her hands to her ears, yet the whispers slipped through, relentless, whispering again and again, each time a little closer. Desperate to escape, she stumbled into the hall and flung open the door to the children's dormitory. The room was still, dimly lit by the pale blue of morning. Every child was in bed, their eyes closed, their faces calm. But though their lips were motionless, the voices did not stop. The whispering continued, rising from their beds, from the walls, from the ceiling itself, a chorus of unseen breath surrounding her. Clara stepped back, heart pounding so hard it hurt, and for an instant the air seemed to shimmer. The whispering broke off abruptly, leaving behind a silence so sudden it rang in her ears. Then, from one of the beds near the window, a small boy opened his eyes and looked at her. His mouth didn't move, but she heard him clearly, right beside her ear. "It's your turn now." The storm came without warning, a low growl of thunder rolling across the mountains and settling over the orphanage like a curse. Rain lashed against the windows, and the house groaned as though bracing itself. Clara sat in the study, the old ledgers spread before her, though she had long stopped pretending to work. Her hands were cold, her pulse uneven, and her thoughts kept circling back to the whispers that had spoken her name. She needed answers, something to make sense of the strange pattern that threaded through every part of the orphanage. When the lightning flashed, she caught sight of a small iron key glinting on the edge of the fireplace mantel. She didn't remember seeing it before, but something about its deliberate placement made her skin crawl. She took it, the metal icy against her fingers, and on a reckless impulse went to the locked drawer at the bottom of the headmistress's desk. The key fit perfectly. Inside were only two things, a journal bound in cracked leather and a small vial filled with dark, hardened residue that might once have been blood. The smell of soot clung to both. Clara opened the journal carefully, each page brittle with age. The first entries were mundane notes on supply shortages, illness among the children, but as the pages turned, the tone changed. The handwriting grew frantic, the ink darker, as if pressed into the paper with desperation. She read of the winter 2 years before the fire, when a sickness swept through the orphanage, taking nearly all of the children within weeks. The headmistress had written of her grief and her refusal to let them go. The final entries spoke of a ritual, a way to preserve their innocence by binding their souls to the house until they could be reborn. The process required fire, smoke, and the recitation of names beneath the pines. Clara's hands trembled as she read the last passage, the ink smudged and uneven. The forest accepts them. The house will hold them. But it demands one more. A crash of thunder shook the walls, and the candle beside her sputtered out. In the sudden dark, the journal pages fluttered though there was no wind. The faint hum returned, distant at first, then closer, rising from the floor beneath her. She slammed the journal shut and stumbled to her feet. Through the rain-streaked window, she saw the faint glow of light moving through the trees behind the orphanage, small, flickering shapes like lanterns or candles, 12 of them, swaying in a line. For a moment, she thought she heard children singing softly, the sound drifting through the storm, repeating a single phrase she couldn't quite understand. By the following evening, the storm had not passed. The sky hung low and bruised, and the wind wailed through the eaves as though the forest itself were grieving. Clara tried to keep the lamps lit, but each one flickered and died, the flames smothered by a creeping smell of smoke that came from nowhere she could find. The air had changed, it carried a warmth that did not belong to winter. When she pressed her hand to the wall, she could feel a faint vibration beneath the wallpaper, rhythmic and pulsing, like a slow heartbeat. She thought she might be imagining it until she heard the sound again, the low crackle of fire, but there was no light, no visible flame, only the scent of burning wood. The children moved strangely that day. They no longer hummed but instead walked the halls in silence, their steps perfectly synchronized, their faces blank. When Clara spoke to them, they did not answer. They passed her as if she were invisible, their eyes fixed forward, all heading in the same direction, the west wing. Fear coiled in her chest, but she followed them, her footsteps muffled by the thick, oppressive heat that had settled through the building. The hallway leading to the forbidden door glowed faintly, though there were no lamps to account for it. The air shimmered as though filled with invisible embers. The smell of ash grew stronger the closer she came. She heard faint voices again, whispering her name, calling her softly through the walls. Her vision swam in the haze. For a moment she thought she saw the wallpaper ripple like fabric, breathing in and out. A sound cracked through the silence, wood splitting somewhere deep within the house, and then came a flash of light so bright she shielded her eyes. But when it faded, there was no flame. The corridor was unburned, though the air shimmered with heat, and faint outlines of hands seemed pressed against the plaster, dark and shifting as if trapped behind it. The temperature rose until she could barely breathe. Smoke curled through the floorboards, coiling around her ankles, though there was nothing burning in sight. She backed away, her throat tight, and as she turned, she saw the veiled woman standing at the far end of the corridor. The veil was gone now, her face grey and cracked like old wood, eyes hollow and glinting faintly in the dark. "It remembers," the woman whispered. "The fire never left." Then she vanished, leaving only the faint trail of ash falling to the floor, and the sound of distant, ghostly laughter echoing from behind the west wing door. The night the whispers called her name for the last time, the forest outside had gone utterly still. Not even the wind moved through the pines. The orphanage stood in darkness, its walls faintly glowing with the memory of the fire that had never truly burned out. Clara sat in the main hall, the children gathered silently around her, their eyes fixed and unblinking. The veiled woman was nowhere to be found. Every candle in the building had gone out at once, and though she tried to relight them, the matches crumbled in her hands. Only the faint pulse of warmth beneath the floorboards remained, a steady throb that rose through the soles of her shoes and into her bones. The humming began again, soft, melodic, unmistakable. But this time, Clara realized it wasn't coming from the children. Their lips did not move, their chests did not rise with breath. The sound came from the walls, from the floor, from the ancient timbers that held the house together. The orphanage was singing, and the tune was the same she had heard on her first night, echoing through the fog. Her heart raced as she backed away, her hands trembling. She whispered for the children to wake, to move, to run, but none responded. Their stillness was complete, their faces serene, almost reverent. Outside, through the cracked windows, she saw the forest begin to shimmer. The mist glowed faintly, and among the trees, she could make out small figures moving, 12 of them, drifting between the pines like shadows. They held no candles this time, their forms glowed with their own pale light. Each one looked toward the orphanage, and though she could not see their faces clearly, she knew who they were. The ones from the photograph. The ones buried behind the pines. The hum grew louder until the walls began to tremble. The floor beneath her feet darkened, and for a heartbeat, she saw flame flicker beneath the boards, licking upward through the cracks. She turned to flee, but the children had risen, blocking her path, their eyes glowing faintly gold. In their expression there was no malice, only expectation, a terrible understanding that she did not share. From above came a whisper, low and steady, the voice of the house itself. "The 13th returns." Clara stumbled backward, her hand pressed to her chest as memories she didn't recognize flooded her mind, smoke, laughter, the feel of tiny hands gripping hers as fire roared around them. The whisper came again, softer now, almost kind. "You came back to finish what we began." The children's eyes closed in unison, and the orphanage exhaled, the sound of 1,000 breaths released at once as the light from the forest poured through the windows like dawn.